The chandeliers above the Zurich Grand Palais shimmered like constellations suspended in glass, scattering 1,000 fragments of light across gowns the color of moonlight and champagne. A string quartet played something elegant and unintrusive, the kind of music designed to flatter conversation rather than silence it. Waiters drifted through the crowd like choreography. White gloves, silver trays, perfect posture. It was the Global Impact Gala of 2027, an evening where power disguised itself as generosity. At the center of it all stood Ethan Cole, New York-born, Zurich-based, impossibly polished in his black tuxedo. His smile was the well-rehearsed kind that belonged to a man who had never known real consequence. Around him orbited investors, politicians, and socialites, their laughter bubbling like Prosecco. On his arm, Harper Vale glowed in a gown of pale gold silk, her diamond ring catching every camera flash. The engagement had been announced only a week ago, and the European press had devoured it whole. America's power couple of the year. When Ethan raised his glass to toast the evening's success, he thought himself invincible. And then, the orchestra paused. It was almost imperceptible at first, a ripple in the rhythm of the night. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, spilling a hush through the crowd like a slow wave, the kind of silence that feels like recognition before memory can name it. Every head turned, and there she was, Amara Hayes. She stood framed by the doorway, illuminated by the crystal light as if the universe had decided to unveil its secret masterpiece. Gone was the woman they remembered, the one whose world had collapsed in New York's gossip columns 3 years earlier. This Amara moved with the calm assurance of someone who had crossed through fire and made peace with the burn marks. Her dress was not ostentatious, midnight silk cut to precision, understated, devastating. No jewels, no glitter, no apologies. Only the kind of beauty that cannot be bought. Composure. Conversation died, breath held collective. Harper's smile faltered. Ethan's glass tilted slightly in his hand, catching light like a blade. The photographers, uncertain at first, began to whisper her name in disbelief. It passed through the room in currents. Amara. Amara Hayes. She didn't flinch. She didn't even glance in Ethan's direction. Her gaze swept over the ballroom once, measured, detached, and then she smiled at the event coordinator, as if she had simply arrived fashionably late to a gathering of old acquaintances. "Ms. Hayes," the coordinator stammered, stepping forward. We're honored. Your firm's contribution this year has been extraordinary." Amara nodded graciously. "Impact matters more than recognition," she said softly, and somehow her voice carried across the hall, warm yet razor-edged. The irony was exquisite. Everyone remembered the scandal, the marriage to Ethan Cole, their empire of investment and influence, her sudden disappearance after the divorce that the tabloids called catastrophic. They had called her ambitious, difficult, impossible. Yet here she stood, radiant and unbothered, her name now tied to Hayes and Markov Capital, the firm that had quietly reshaped emerging markets across Africa and Eastern Europe. Ethan could feel every heartbeat pounding against the shell of his ribs. Harper leaned closer, whispering through a fixed smile. "Is that?" He didn't answer. His throat had closed. Because seeing Amara again was not nostalgia, it was revelation. He had thought she was gone, defeated, erased, but she had returned, transformed into something luminous, untouchable. Across the ballroom, Amara accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Her fingers were steady, her eyes serene. She was no longer the wife who had once bent herself into shapes that would fit a man's expectations. She was a woman who had built an empire from the rubble of her own heartbreak. And Ethan finally understood what true power looked like. It was not in wealth or applause. It was the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to be seen to be known. As the night unfolded, people began to drift toward her, drawn by curiosity cloaked as courtesy. Diplomats wanted her opinion. Bankers wanted her card. Socialites wanted her approval. She gave them all the same gift, genuine attention wrapped in calm distance. Harper smiled too brightly and spoke too loudly. Ethan laughed too hard at jokes that landed flat. But no one noticed them anymore. The room had found a new orbit. When Amara finally turned her head, their eyes met, just once, for the briefest moment. It wasn't a look of accusation or longing. It was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that they had shared a life, a history, and that history no longer bound them. She raised her glass slightly, a gesture so small it could have been mistaken for civility. Yet Ethan felt it like judgment. Then she turned away, her silhouette disappearing into the soft blur of music and light. Outside, snow began to fall over Zurich, blanketing the city in white silence. Inside, the music resumed. The gala continued as if nothing had happened. But something had, something irreversible. For Amara, it was not a return to the past. It was the reclaiming of her own narrative. She had walked back into the very world that once tried to break her, not to seek approval, but to stand in her own power. And somewhere, in the unspoken language of elegance and restraint, the room understood that they were witnessing something rare, redemption not performed but embodied. If you've ever found yourself rooting for the woman who rises when no one expects her to, stay a little longer. Like, comment, and follow for the next chapter of Amara Hayes' story, because this is only the beginning. The fire she carries has miles yet to travel. Before Zurich, before the betrayals and reinventions, there was New York, wild, electric, and endlessly awake. It was a city that didn't just hum, it pulsed, as if the buildings themselves had heartbeats. In 2014, Amara Hayes was 24, and still believed that brilliance alone could protect her from heartbreak. She lived in a small apartment on the Upper West Side, too close to the subway to be quiet, too far from comfort to be easy. Every night she fell asleep to the rhythm of traffic and possibility. She had grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of a public school teacher and a postal worker, neither of whom had ever stepped foot in a marble-floored lobby. But Amara had always seen the world in equations, patterns that other people missed. When she earned a full scholarship to Columbia for her master's in economics, she swore she would make the most of it. The girl from the South with natural curls, thrifted blazers, and the kind of mind that could unspool markets like poetry. The night she met Ethan Cole was an accident, dressed as fate. It was at a fundraiser for an entrepreneurship fellowship she had joined, a cocktail event she could barely afford to attend. She'd borrowed a black dress from her roommate, ironed it twice, and arrived late, clutching a glass of cheap white wine that tasted like compromise. Ethan was speaking on stage when she walked in. He had that calm authority of someone who belonged everywhere. His voice was smooth, practiced, just rough enough at the edges to sound spontaneous. "We talk about innovation," he said, "but we forget that innovation starts with hunger, the kind that doesn't fade when you've eaten." The audience laughed politely. Amara didn't. She was watching him too closely for charm. What she saw was a man used to attention, but not necessarily used to earning it. Later, when the speeches ended, he found her by the bar, studying a spreadsheet on her phone. "You're the only person here doing math," he said, half amused. "I'm the only person here who still has student loans," she replied without looking up. He laughed, really laughed, not the social kind. "Ethan Cole." She met his gaze. Amara Hayes. The handshake was brief but electric. He was older by almost 10 years, already a senior associate at a law firm that dealt in transnational mergers. His world was bespoke suits and rooftop views, espresso machines that cost more than her annual rent. She should have known better, but she didn't yet understand that intellect doesn't make you immune to magnetism. He called her the next day, then again, then every day after. Their first date was at a small Ethiopian restaurant in Harlem. He had never eaten with his hands before. She showed him how, teasing him when he tried to roll the injera too neatly. He asked her about her thesis, comparative market growth in transitional economies, and actually listened. "Do you ever stop thinking about numbers?" he asked that night. "Only when I'm thinking about people," she said. He smiled like he discovered something precious. "Then I hope I stay interesting." From there, it became a rhythm neither of them questioned. Weekends at art galleries in Soho. Late-night walks through the city, talking about ambition, as though it were a shared language. He took her to the opera once, where she fell asleep halfway through. Afterward, he whispered, "You're not made for stillness." He admired her fire. She mistook his admiration for understanding. Months later, he flew to Zurich for a corporate retreat and sent her a message. "You'd love it here. Clean streets, clean money, clean air. the kind of place people reinvent themselves. When his firm opened a European branch, he invited her to join him. "We could build something together," he said one evening as they stood on his apartment balcony overlooking Central Park. The city lights reflected in his eyes like a promise. "You handle numbers, I handle law. We could be unstoppable." For Amara, it wasn't just love. It was partnership, the kind she had always dreamed of. She had spent her life pushing through doors that weren't built for her, and here was a man offering to hold one open. Her professors warned her not to mix career and romance. Her mother, in a softer tone, asked, "Baby, does he see all of you, or just the part that fits into his story?" Amara didn't answer. She only smiled and said, "He believes in me, Mama." So she moved to Zurich. Their apartment overlooked the Limmat River, where sunlight scattered like coins on the water. Amara learned to speak German phrases for the market vendors, to navigate cobblestone streets in heels, to host dinners for Ethan's colleagues where she smiled and discussed global trade policies while making sure the wine glasses never emptied. Ethan's firm flourished. His partners praised his strategic genius, unaware that Amara was the one refining his presentations late into the night, transforming raw figures into elegant persuasion. He would kiss the top of her head and murmur, "I couldn't do this without you." And she believed him, because back then, she still thought love was a shared equation. Their life looked perfect. Mornings with espresso on the balcony, evenings filled with laughter and small luxuries. Yet beneath the polished surface, subtle fractures began to form, tiny, invisible, like cracks in glass that only light can reveal. Sometimes he would joke about her intensity. "You analyze everything," he'd say, "even love." And she'd laugh, pretending it didn't sting. But there were nights when she woke and found him already awake, scrolling through his phone, eyes distant. When she reached for him, his smile returned too quickly. She told herself it was work. That love ebbs and flows. That partnership means endurance. She didn't yet know that some storms announce themselves only after the calmest skies. Contentitions of the budget law. In the quiet hum of Zurich mornings yet to come, she would remember these early days, not for their perfection, but for their innocence. The way he once looked at her as if she were the future, and the way she mistook that gaze for forever. For a while, the world they built together felt less like two lives crossing and more like one carefully engineered machine, sleek, efficient, and dazzling in its motion. Zurich mornings began with a ritual. Amara at the kitchen table with a battered laptop and fresh espresso, Ethan skimming legal briefs over toast. They moved through the day with practiced synchrony, colleagues calling them a power couple with a sound more approving than jealous. Invitations arrived in matching envelopes. Photographers learned their angles. Praise folded into their evening conversations like a warm cloth. Amara took to the work with a kind of tender ferocity. She had always loved patterns, the arcs of data, the way supply and demand whispered to one another across borders. In Ethan's firm, she found an arena for that love. Where lawyers spoke in clauses and contingencies, she translated markets into stories investors wanted to believe. She retooled their pitch decks, introduced analytic models that mapped risk in previously invisible ways, and taught the partners to read the subtle grammar of emerging economies. Within a year, the investment division's performance metrics changed color, from cautious green to unambiguous upward arrows. Colleagues began to rely on the clarity she brought. Margot Schneider, a Geneva-based portfolio director who loved to cut to the bone in meetings, once said under her breath in a closed-door strategy session, "She has the patience to see what everyone else misses." Margot became one of the few to see Amara's work without the filter of Ethan's name, an ally who would later become more than a colleague, a friend who could be blunt and steady in ways the polished ballroom never allowed. Their apartment on the Limmat was practical, modern, a library of books Amara actually read, a collection of records Ethan insisted on for their Sunday afternoons. They entertained investors and artists with equal ease. Amara would explain the macroeconomic case for an investment, while Ethan supplied legal guardrails. They worked as if constructing a cathedral, each stone deliberate, each window placed for light. It felt like mastery. Yet perfection, she discovered, could be a gilded cage. The first fissures were small, an offhanded compliment from Ethan that landed like a reprimand. "You're intense," he would tell her, smiling, as if intensity were a picturesque quirk rather than the engine of her thought. He would joke in front of partners, "Don't let Amara overanalyze the champagne." And the room would laugh, because he had shaped the laughter that night. She would laugh too, not because it was funny, but because a pause held fewer consequences. There were subtler slippages. In boardrooms frigid with male unanimity, Amara's recommendations were sometimes preemptively softened when introduced by Ethan. A partner would nod at her data, then look to Ethan for the final nod. The patriarchal habit of seeking a white man's seal, even when the argument bore her fingerprints. She learned the economy of silence in those moments, to restrain indignation into a smile and let results speak in graphs and quarterly returns. She took the restraint home with her. Love, she thought, should be elastic. She could bear a few cuts for the architecture they were building. Ethan's hand on her back at a fundraiser. His whispered praise after a successful negotiation. The way he would in private call her, "my mind," with fondness. These things felt like recompense for the small erasures. Besides, she told herself, sacrifice was part of partnership, the currency of shared ambition. But sacrifice is a treacherous ledger. It keeps exact account. There were nights when she lay awake while he returned late from dinners in offices, smelling of cigar smoke and cheap cologne, the kind of rooms that traded in history more than idea. There were mornings when his kiss felt like a punctuation mark rather than a promise. She found herself rewriting presentations at 2 in the morning, smoothing language that would please conservative donors. The same donors who listened politely and then expected a softer voice in the women they could afford to patronize. Her mind cataloged the inequities with clinical precision, and the catalog grew heavy. She began to notice how often she apologized for being direct, how often she tempered brilliance with charm to make it palatable. She began to practice softness like performance. The tilt of a head, the laugh that made criticism pass like breeze. When the firm celebrated a milestone, contracts signed in Prague, a joint venture in Warsaw, the press framed Ethan as the face of the achievement. "Coal leads transatlantic expansion," the headline read in a prominent magazine. In small print, tucked beneath a portrait of him, a sentence acknowledged her contribution. The sentence felt like dust. The first real argument between them happened in the wake of such an article. Amara had returned from a meeting with numbers that would change the division's next quarter. She found Ethan on the balcony, the city a smear of light below. "Did you see the coverage?" she asked, placing the dossier on the table. He pulled the pages toward him and smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "They did what they always do," he said. "They listed you first," she replied. Her voice was flat. Irritation sharpened it. He inhaled. "It's PRM. They need a face." He used the nickname she had only allowed him in private. "We know what you did." "I know." "You should not have to be known to be recognized," she said. "Recognition matters, Ethan. It buys leverage. It protects work." He looked at her, then as if seeing a problem he could edit away. "You're overworking. You're exhausted. You sound argumentative." It was the word that lodged in her throat. Argumentative. A feminine accusation draped in good manners. She wanted to tell him that her tone was a response to being erased, but the words flared and cooled in her mouth, tempered by the calculus of consequence. Later, in their bed, he murmured apologies. Small, efficient gestures that offered warmth enough to soothe and not enough to heal. "You know I wouldn't be here without you," he said. "Don't let this ruin us." She believed him then because believing was survivable. She believed him because the construct they had assembled looked too beautiful to dismantle. And so she smoothed the crack with honeyed words and turned the light out on the room, where their reflection looked like two halves of a whole. Outside the window, the city of Zurich continued its indifferent hum. Inside, the machine continued to purr. Perfection kept its appointments, and beneath the polished surface, a patience built its quiet ledger, a sum that would, one day, demand reckoning. The rain that day had the small, insistent quality of a metronome, setting a rhythm that made the city tidy itself into reflections. Amara's train into Zurich was an hour late. A mercy, she told herself. More time to finish an email, more time to breathe. She had been in Prague for a due diligence meeting with a fledgling fintech. The work had been precise and satisfying. Her suitcase was a practical thing, full of neatly folded shirts and the scent of espresso. She imagined arriving, stepping into their apartment, and letting the warmth of home fold around her like a familiar coat. The elevator on the Limmat building smelled faintly of lemon polish and something else she could not name. Perfume, perhaps, floral and new. She pressed the button for the top floor, each floor passing like a soft argument in the belly of the building. When the door sighed open, laughter greeted her. Low, bright, intimate in that way only private rooms permit. It should have been warmth. Instead, it landed like a blow. The living room light was too soft. The candles half melted on the coffee table. A woman's scarf was draped over the back of the couch like a careless punctuation. There was music, light, contemporary, the kind that suggested a world of brunches and brand deals. And there, on the couch, utterly at ease, was a woman Amara had seen at a few firm events in passing. Harper Vale, polished, precisely young, the kind of beauty that had been tended with as much calculation as a brand launch. Harper's laughter rose, bright as shards of glass. Ethan looked up at her then, and the room oxygenated into slow motion. He had been holding a strawberry between his fingers, red, lacquered, absurd, and was feeding it to Harper as if they were in the middle of some private, indulgent ritual. His hand lingered at the back of her neck when she leaned back, and the familiarity in his gesture was what cleaved at Amara's ribs. For a heartbeat, only disbelief kept the world coherent. Then the script she had rehearsed 1,000 times, "This cannot be happening," collapsed. She stood in the doorway, rain dampening the hem of her coat, and watched as the life she thought steady unfurled into something brittle and foreign. "Amara," Ethan said, one name, delivered like a calculus problem, neat and clean. He rose slowly, the courtesies of a man trained to smooth awkwardness into transactions. "You're home early." Harper's eyes flicked up, then down. A smile that had not planned for this intrusion tightened into something courteous. "Oh, Miss Hayes, I didn't expect you back so soon." The syllables were careful. The room smelled now of citrus and something sweeter, perfume, heavy with promises. Amara's voice found its surface with the quiet of winter. "Who is she?" Ethan blinked, as though surprised by a question that demanded a multiplication table's worth of complexity. He set the strawberry down on the saucer with more deliberation than the gesture required. "Harper Vale," he said. "She consults on public relations. We're colleagues." A lie like that needed only a nod to hold it up. But Harper's hand still rested against Ethan's wrist, the small intimacy of someone using another person as a prop. Amara had learned to read these small gestures. They were syllables in a language Ethan thought he had taught himself. "Your colleagues," she repeated slowly, tasting the oddness of the word. "At my house, on my couch." Harper's laugh was a practiced thing, light, exculpatory. "We just lost track of time. It happens." She looked at Ethan for guidance and received none. Ethan's face, which had once been capable of warmth, had folded into something else. Responsibility traded for distance. When he spoke, the words were measured, and each landed like a coin on a marble table. "Amara, we need to talk." There was an intimacy to how he framed it, as if discussions of this kind belonged to a private ledger. She stepped inside and set her suitcase down. The weight of it given ground, she unlatched the quiet she had kept for herself. "Why are you here with her?" she asked. "Why are you doing this in our home?" He sighed, the weary sound of someone explaining a spreadsheet. "This isn't the time to dramatize. I've been unhappy, Amara, for a long time." Unhappy. The word had a bureaucratic precision that made her want to laugh and cry at once. "Unhappy," she echoed. "You think telling me that reduces what you've done to an administrative error?" He folded his hands as if arranging papers. "I didn't plan for this to happen, but it did. I've been honest with myself. He faltered, searching for a punctuation that would make this easier. "I'm in love with Harper. It's been going on for over a year." The sentence sat between them, absurdly plain, and everything Amara had been, student, analyst, partner, felt like a figure sketched in cheap charcoal and then burnt away. "You're in love with her," she said, as if repeating a theorem might make it false. After all the nights you thanked me, after the dinners, after you told the partners I was indispensable, after the things you called ours, Ethan's jaw tightened. For a moment, grief and embarrassment crossed his features like a shadow. We've grown apart, he said. You're so focused on work. You're intense. I don't want to lie to you. I told myself I'd end things after the anniversary. It got complicated. Complicated, she echoed, and the word tasted of betrayal sharpened by a life reduced to PR-ready words. You planned to tell me later. You planned my humiliation to fit your calendar. He looked at her then with a kind of clinical pity. I didn't want to hurt you. The cruelty of that was almost ceremonial. Hurt, he said, like a necessary cost. Amara felt the room spin, then steady in a new plane. She remembered the late nights, the way his hand had retreated first in boardrooms, then in bedrooms. She remembered smoothing his presentations until the edges shone. She remembered believing him because she had to believe someone. Leave, she said softly. Ethan's face flickered with something like confusion. We'll work this out. My lawyers will speak with yours. He could render the dissolution into procedures, into legalese that would parse assets into sums and timelines. But words and signatures could not account for the small economies of a life. Favorite books on a shelf, the dent in the armchair, the mornings they had sneaked shots of espresso while the city woke. He spoke of fairness. She heard the cold clinks of transaction. Clarified, the finality hung there. Harper rose and gathered her scarf, the practiced smile returning like a brand. She brushed past Amara with a touch that sought to assert conquest. Too near, too polished. Amara gathered the few things she needed, a handbag, her passport, the coat still wet from rain. She passed Ethan without looking at him again. The corridor outside the building smelled of wet stone and old lime trees, and the night air cut clean against the damp of her hair. She walked without direction, letting the city carry her, the tram tracks humming like a lost heartbeat beneath her soles. People under umbrellas moved past with the small economies of a world that continued, unaware of lives falling elsewhere. She felt unmoored and, outrageously, unbound. The fracture had opened in the most intimate place, inside a marriage once touted as an ideal. Yet it revealed something harder. The space she had allotted to others had become the room in which she might rebuild. The shock did not immediately feel like strategy. It felt like ash. But in that ash lay an ember she had not tended in years, a mind that solved problems for a living. She let the rain wash the apartment's light from her coat and thought, absurdly, of spreadsheets, of balances and ledgers. The ledger of sacrifice, she realized, had been tallying itself in silence. The numbers could be recalculated. She could be rebuilt. For now, the city was in immediate, generous exile. She kept walking until the ache became a practice of breath. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would call her mentor. Tonight, she would simply feel the fracture, and when the moment came, decide how not to be broken by it. Paris arrived like a sentence, beautiful and final. The city did not announce that it would be kind or cruel. It simply existed, each boulevard a long, indifferent line that would not be altered for a single heart. Amara landed with 2 suitcases and a head full of invoices, legal notices, requests for meetings, the cold, efficient letters that rendered private grief into public paper. She had imagined leaving Zurich as a temporary retreat, a way to recalibrate. The reality was exile, tidy and definite. Her studio in the Marais was so small, the ceiling seemed intent on leaning in to listen. A single window looked out on a courtyard where laundry swayed like surrendered flags. It was charming in listings and cramped in reality, the kind of room that forced a person to face herself in every corner. She kept the few things that mattered. The small leather-bound notebook Ethan had given her on their first anniversary, which she could not bring herself to burn. A stack of academic journals, and a photograph of her mother that she pressed between passport pages as if that would keep home intact. Work evaporated the way humidity does, slowly, steadily. The network she had relied on in Zurich retreated along polite channels. Calls went unanswered, and invitations that once arrived on embossed cards were replaced by silence. Rumors are industrious things. They travel on whispered endorsements and the soft authority of abstention. Someone in a meeting in Geneva said the word difficult. Another, with philanthropic attachments in Zurich, muttered complicated. The effect was surgical. Doors closed without a slam. She sent applications, 40, then 70, and received the same gentle refusals. Thank you for your interest. In an industry built on introductions and reputations, hers had been rebranded as risky collateral. Once, at a small boutique firm in the 11th arrondissement, she sat across from a hiring manager who admired her CV aloud, and then, with the kindness of someone talking himself into a decision, said he couldn't bring someone with recent complications into a client-facing role. He used no names, but the posture of his hands felt like a verdict. Money is a particular kind of truth. It leaves no room for nuance. The funds that had paid for tailored suits and quiet dinners dwindled. Amara sold what she could without regret. Furniture she had loved as discreet acts of letting go. A watch she had bought to mark a promotion that now felt like a prelude to a different life. She took temp work, data entry, translation of legal briefs, administrative shifts that required steady hands, and left the mind free to wander its old, sharp recursions. There were nights she scrubbed someone else's kitchen counter until her knuckles ached, and the floor smelled faintly of chlorine and humiliation. Humiliation has a taxonomy, she learned quickly. There was the mechanical kind, folding hotel linens in a boutique guest house while polite guests slept and left tip envelopes on bedside tables. There was the relational kind, acquaintances who offered condolences in the form of gossip. There was the public kind, whispers at a party about Ethan's engagement that landed like gravel in her shoes. Each variation gathered into a pressure that made living in daylight expensive. The worst moments were not the physical labor, but the erasure. To watch her own name evaporate from proposals she had once drafted. To see a strategy she had planned now attributed to someone else. To feel conversations, once hospitable to her voice, shrink and rearrange themselves around someone else's presence. In those hours, she learned a new humility. She learned what it meant to be unseen in cities where being seen had once been the currency of survival. Only a handful of lights remained in that dark network. Margot Schneider, who had made an enemy of social convenience in Zurich, and thus remained delightfully frank, sent parcels of food and books with notes that read, "Come to my table when you want company that is not pity." Lucille Ndiaye, her mentor from those scholarship days, wrote terse emails threaded with tenderness. "Do not mistake exile for ending. You are still the same mind. Let it do its work." These gestures were small, luminous things that would have been easy to dismiss if they had not kept her breathing. Her mother called with a love lined in worry. "Come home, baby," she said on the phone, the voice of fabric she could still fold into her chest. "Let us take care of you for a little while." Amara closed her eyes and pictured the small kitchen in Atlanta, where her mother still set plates for two and never wasted words on ambition. Returning felt like conceding to a chapter she had not meant to close. It felt like telling the world that the measure of a life was its absence of failure, so she stayed. There were nights when a hardness crept close, a temptation toward endings too simple to be true. Once, walking along the Seine under a sky that was a bruise of cloud, she paused at the rail and thought of the quiet water below. The idea was not dramatic. It was a small, sharp logic, to stop feeling the pressure of other people's verdicts. For a breath, she tasted the possibility of a single motion that would unmake the ache. But in that instant, a memory erupted. A letter from Lucille she had kept folded in the spine of a book. Her mentor's admonition, blunt and fierce, that your life is a question others will try to answer for you. Refuse them that comfort. The words were a small rebuke that pushed her back from the edge. What rose instead was not the brittle thing people call revenge, but something quieter and more formidable, an ember of formidability. Rage, yes, pure, clarifying, molten. It did not ask to be cruel. It asked to be useful. She began, in small, disciplined steps, to build scaffolding. She taught herself the basics of digital marketing in the hours between temp shifts. She coded a bare-bones website on an old laptop whose battery died if left idle too long. She reached out to old contacts with succinct, professional emails. No entreaties, no pleading, only proposals. Most replies were silence. A few were curt. One was golden. Lucille putting her in touch with a small Nairobi fintech seeking advisory help. It was not Zurich, not New York, but it was work, and work was a language she understood without translation. Exile had stripped her to essentials, the ledger of skills, the stubbornness she had been raised on, the imperative to make the mind a refuge. She learned the economy of compromise, how to trade temporary embarrassment for long-term possibility. She cleaned and translated and took meetings in cafes where the coffee tasted of bitterness she now welcomed. She kept her photograph of her mother folded inside her passport and carried it like an altar. In the quiet hours of the Marais, amid the rhythmic sound of laundry in the courtyard, she began to write the blueprints of something new. It was not yet a strategy. It was a list. Markets she knew, personal contacts abroad, a thesis about overlooked talent in transitional economies. The paper was small and precise, the same way she now wanted her life to be. The ember inside of her tasted of cold iron and determination. Exile had done one cruel thing and one generous one. It had taken away the props of a life and left the raw materials. She would not be undone by loss. The ledger of sacrifice had been keeping itself for years. She would now balance it with intent. When dawn found Paris rinsed in a pale new light, Amara pressed the notebook closed and felt, for the first time since the fracture, the steady return of a pulse that belonged to her alone. The party was by design an exercise in measured conviviality, a salon hosted in a 16th arrondissement apartment whose cornices still remembered the hand of craftsmen long gone. Candles burned like patient witnesses on side tables. The music was a low, warm thing that gave people permission to speak truths that sounded like gossip. Amara had said no at first. Then Margot, who would not accept defeat in the name of solidarity, had insisted. "You will not camp in sorrow like a martyr," she had told Amara over the phone, folding the sentence into an order and a plea. "Come for 2 hours, come to be seen as you are, not as they painted you." She arrived late, a presence that required no ceremony, a practical coat, a scarf, hair pulled back with a simplicity that made the room notice without needing to stare. For a while, she hovered at the edge of a conversation about seed funding in Lagos, nodding when something clever was said, amused when a pundit made the same tired joke about unicorns. Being there felt like a rehearsal in which she was learning the cadence of her own voice again. Then she heard it. Two women near the drinks table, their laughter thin as lace, were listing the latest society items like a catechism. Names folded into sentences as if the syllables themselves confirmed belonging. "Did you see the photos from Zurich? Ethan and Harper, finally. That engagement ring is outrageous. The wedding at the Grand Palais will be the event of the season." The voice made a little dramatized sigh at the end, a flourish of appetite. "And the first wife?" the other woman chimed, tapping her phone like calling attention to a private file. "What was her name? Amara? I heard she completely imploded. Didn't she end up in Paris doing, what was it, translation work? Such a tragedy." They laughed like currency. The sound slid through the room, found Amara's ears, and landed in the hollow she had been wearing like a coat. For the breadth of a breath she considered leaving then and there. It was the safe, pragmatic choice. But she remained, because staying inside the small discomfort felt less like cowardice and more like an experiment, to see what currents still ran through a society that claimed to value foundations rather than performance. She moved away from them and the cluster of men who were congratulating themselves on market forecasts. She crossed the room and found a small terrace that overlooked an inner courtyard lit by a single sodium lamp. The night air tasted of chestnut smoke and distant car exhaust, like a gray watercolor. She pressed her palm to the cool metal railing and let the city's soft ache enter her. A thought arrived then, lightning, but not the kind that destroys. What if it were all simpler to stop? The image of the Seine in Paris had lodged in her memory as a place where the water gathered the city's fallen leaves. It felt at once sacred and indifferent. For a whisper of time, she allowed herself to imagine the motion. Step forward. Let the river take the ledger she could not reconcile. The idea had no melodrama to it. It was arithmetic disguised as mercy. But along with that slippery logic came another sensation, older, stranger. Rage so precise it felt almost judicial. It rose not from vanity, but from the principle that she would not allow other people's stories to settle on her head like a verdict. The anger clarified her. It sharpened her focus like a lens being drawn down over an image. The water below did not erase effort. It finalized nothing she had built. She had not worked through nights and proposals to be a footnote in someone else's victory speech. Instead of retreating, she found herself laughing, a sound that surprised even her. Soft, not bitter. It was the kind of laugh that terrifies a lie because it refuses to feed it. She drew her phone from her pocket and scrolled through messages until she found one she had saved months earlier. A terse line from Lucille. Remember whose mind built the map. The phrase felt like a talisman. Her hands steadied. Back inside, the conversation had moved on. The women who had been gleeful now spoke of bridesmaids and color palettes. Ethan's name rose and fell like an item in a catalog. She watched them for a moment, an anthropologist cataloging gesture and posture, and then she turned to a woman nearby whose badge indicated a fintech incubator in Nairobi. "Tell me about your portfolio," Amara said. The woman blinked, then brightened with the relief of finding someone who asked what mattered more than what looked good. The talk moved from decor to data. In the space of 15 minutes, Amara was in her element, parsing scaling strategies, identifying a misaligned KPI. The woman took notes, then asked for a contact. Amara gave her one. Not a number she had bought, but a link to a thought she had recently coded into the back of an unfinished pitch. The exchange felt like reclaiming a small territory. On the terrace later, Margot found her. "You look less like someone we should rescue," she said, the compliment rough with affection. "You look like someone who might come back in triumph and break a few lacquered things." Amara smiled. She thought of the ledgers she intended to reopen, the markets no one else wanted, the arc of talent that Western money misread as risk. She thought of the nights spent scrubbing tile, the cold and precise humiliation that had not broken her but had made her economical with sentiment, efficient with grief. That evening, the edge did not close into safety. It sharpened into a plan. She would sketch a roadmap, not for vengeance but for a rigorous return. The first step would be work, a concrete contract, however small, that would allow her to speak again in meetings not as a rumor, but as an authority. The second would be rebuilding trust, not with those who had ostracized her, but with herself and the few who had remained faithful. Outside, Paris found its quiet. Inside, the party thinned and candles guttered into quiet pools of wax. Amara walked back into the room with a steadier pace than when she had arrived, carrying a purpose that made the gossip feel thin as tissue. She had come to the edge and tasted its logic. She had stepped back by choice. The night had not broken her. It taught her how to choose what she would not surrender again. The blueprint arrived not as a single illuminating revelation, but as a succession of patient truths folded into a notebook she kept beneath her pillow. Each morning in the Marais, Amara uncapped her pen like a ritual and turned one more page of possibility into plan. The paper smelled faintly of ink and laundry soap. In the small light of the studio, it looked like a map sketched by someone who had learned geography by walking, not by reading. She began with inventory. Loss had pared her life down to essentials: skills, contacts, stamina. She listed them with the clinical tenderness of an economist. Languages: French near fluent, German serviceable. Market knowledge: Eastern Europe, select African hubs. Networks: one former partner in Zurich, a handful of founders in Nairobi. And the one thing that never left her even in the hardest nights: the ability to see patterns before they were visible to others. At the bottom of the page she wrote, in a hand steadier than she felt, micro-consultancy, bridging Western capital and emerging tech. She sold what she could without theatrics. A leather briefcase she had loved went to a buyer who negotiated like an art dealer. The watch Ethan had given her for a promotion changed hands for a price that felt both humiliating and necessary. Each item traded was a small, moral recalculation. What she let go of and what she kept. Her mother's photograph remained tucked in the passport. Certain anchors were non-negotiable. The laptop was a relic whose battery clenched and died if asked too much, but it bore the first drafts of everything she would become. By day, she took temp work. The rhythm of other people's schedules taught her discipline. And by night, she built. She watched free tutorials, learned SEO fundamentals, coded a simple landing page, and taught herself the kinds of social copy that attracted not vanity, but relevance. Her website was modest, a clear thesis statement, case studies drafted from memory, and a contact form that asked only for the work's purpose. It was not polished, it was honest. Her first outreach emails felt like small confessions. She wrote them with the same meticulousness she once used to craft investment memos. Concise subject line, a single paragraph of value, and a link to her kernel of ideas. Most replies were silence. A few were polite rejections. Then, one morning, she received a message that read, "We need help with go-to-market strategy for payments in Nairobi. Do you have time?" The sender was a founder Margot had once mentioned in passing, an introduction Lucille had quietly brokered. The message arrived like a thin rope thrown across a ravine. The contract was modest. Advisory hours paid at a rate that would not replace the penthouse's rent. But it was work that demanded the specific angle only Amara could provide. She dove in. She took calls at dawn to accommodate time zones. She constructed frameworks that accounted for mobile money penetration, regulatory creep, and the complex dance of trust that local entrepreneurs performed with diaspora investors. She wrote a pitch that treated the product like a social infrastructure, convenience wrapped in cultural literacy. Her suggestions were not theoretical. They were rooted in lived observation and the patient arithmetic of emerging markets. The first result was small and luminous. Her recommendations led to a pilot partnership with a regional telco that doubled projected user trials. When the founder sent a voice note, frantic with excitement, saying that investors were now paying attention, Amara closed her laptop and let herself cry for 30 seconds, the sound swallowed by the thin studio walls. It was not a sob of defeat, but of release, recognition that labor, when honest, still demanded its due. Word traveled in the practical networks that mattered, through founders who spoke to founders, not through the glossy pages that had once told stories of her failure. A second client came, then a third. The numbers were small but consistent. She invoiced, tracked cash flow with the same care she had once reserved for portfolios, and learned again how to convert scarce resources into leverage. Each small contract was a vote of confidence she had not expected to need, but was grateful to earn. There were harder nights. She wrestled with the indignity of taking advice from younger analysts who had no memory of her tenure in Zurich, and yet offered structural templates she had not considered. There were proposals that did not land, and grants that closed before she could apply. And there were the moments when headlines about Ethan's life, weddings, galas, the comfortable continuity he seemed to enjoy, slid across her phone screen like invitations to old grief. Those images stung as salt will sting a fresh wound. Still, she learned to treat envy like weather, an unpleasant forecast to note and move through. What transformed the blueprint from idea to structure was not only the contracts, but the alliances she curated. Margot remained a fierce presence, sending introductions that cut through propriety, and Lucille's emails offered not only counsel but blunt expectation. "You're building a spine," Lucille wrote once. "Now build muscles." In London, a retired academic she had met at a conference taught her the craft of policy framing. In Nairobi, a founder introduced her to a woman who knew how to navigate regulatory corridors. Each link was a small scaffolding. By late autumn, her desk was a geometry of papers, project outlines, a calendar of calls, receipts. A hand-lettered sticky note on her monitor read, "Start with what you can prove." She found stability in the modest disciplines, an invoicing cadence, a checklist for deliverables, a weekly hour for reading about sectors outside her immediate expertise so her perspective would not calcify. The blueprint was no longer a single-sheet dream. It was a living document adjusting to new data. And beneath her plans, something softer began to evolve. A personal ethic that balanced ambition with the tenderness she once reserved for other people's needs. She had promised herself that rebuilding would not mean replicating the self that had been easy to erase. So she took small mercies. A weekend run through Luxembourg Gardens that made her lungs flame with gratitude. A phone call to her mother that was less about reassurance and more about laughter. A cheap dessert eaten with the kind of indulgence she had denied herself when the world expected stoic austerity. On a Wednesday, a courier brought a box with the first engraved business card she had printed in a fit of private optimism. The letters were simple: Amara Hayes, strategic advisor. She turned one over in her hand and felt an odd, buoyant gravity. The blueprint was not yet a building, but it had become a scaffold that could hold weight. She slipped the cards into the leather briefcase she had kept and, for a moment, allowed herself to imagine a future where she no longer measured worth by the endorsements of those who had done her harm. Outside, Paris narrowed into evening, and the studio's single window framed a slice of sky that was forgiving that day. Amara closed the notebook and, before sleep took her, traced the margin of the page where she had written in small letters, "Begin with truth. Build with rigor." The plan was practical, stern, and hopeful, the exact architecture she needed. London arrived like a clean page. The sky over Bloomsbury was thin and bright, the kind of light that sharpens edges and refuses romanticism. It was the day Amara needed. Lucille had called it bluntly, "You will go, you will speak, you will not accept comfort." The invitation was less an ask than a command folded in care. The symposium at the School of Global Investment gathered an unusual cross-section: rigid academics, restless entrepreneurs, and a handful of investors who liked to think of risk as a tasteful accessory. For Amara, it was a stage less for spectacle than for rehearsal of competence. She arrived with the modest pride of someone who had learned how to carry herself again. Her suit was a tailored charcoal that fit like truth, not designed to impress but to hold the person inside it steady. She had prepared her notes with the meticulousness of a surgeon. Case studies from Nairobi mapped alongside cautious, humane proposals for regulatory partnership. When she stepped onto the panel, the auditorium leaned in the gentle way that an audience does when it suspects something useful is about to be said. Afterward, the room clustered into the familiar orbit of small talk. People who wanted to be seen next to thinkers found each other and practiced conviviality. Lucille navigated the currents like a small, brilliant vessel. She introduced Amara with a sentence that felt like both endorsement and challenge. "Listen to her. She's been in the markets you only read about in op-eds." It was the kind of line that made people sit up properly. He found her during the coffee break. Leon Markov did not enter the room like a storm. He arrived with the quiet, deliberate steps of someone who had counted everything twice. He was not ostentatious. Mid-50, hair threaded with silver, a face that carried geography, lines that suggested both hardship and endurance. When he extended his hand, the pressure was courteous, the palm warm and steady. "I heard you on the panel," he said in an accent soft as gravel. "You're thinking on mobile credit adoption, very precise." She measured him the way she measured a spreadsheet: interest, then margin, then intention. "Thank you," she said. "Your firm invests in the region, yes? I've read a few of your deals." He smiled, not the rehearsed investor's smile, but one that admitted appetite. "We do. We look for edges. Sometimes those edges are in talent, not technology." Lucille watched, her expression unreadable. When they walked to a quieter corner, she murmured, "Pay attention." Leon spoke plain. He had the manner of a man who had seen a pattern early, and then had the patience to let the proof arrive. He described markets not as bullet points, but as people. The barber in Nairobi who accepted mobile payments before a bank would, the teacher in Accra who taught her students digital literacy because she saw futures. He spoke of portfolio construction and the dull arithmetic of returns, but his curiosity always returned to the human calculus. "I invest in judgment," he said, "not narratives." Amara found his language familiar in its humility. It did not pander, it acknowledged complexity. She explained, in direct notes and warm examples, where Western investors misread cultural signals as risk, and where a more nuanced approach could yield outsized returns. He listened, then paused. then asked questions that were not tests, but invitations. How would you design a fund that paid advisors in equity rather than only fees? How do you embed local governance without handing control to parochial power? When she answered, she realized she was talking to someone who had already begun to imagine the architecture she had been sketching in Paris. He asked about structure, about legal frameworks, about due diligence practices that would respect local norms. The conversation moved like good work, precise, mutual, enlivening. Would you consider leading something? Leon asked finally, his tone careful. Not as a consultant, as a partner, an entity that combines your regional expertise with my capital and distribution. The sentence hung like a possibility, luminous and sharp. She felt the familiar flicker, hope braided with the grit of caution. Partnership carried its own dangers, she knew. She had seen partnerships that diminished more than enabled. She was not naive about the subtle erasures that could occur when power came wrapped in capital. She thought of Ethan's polite diminutions, of the way credit had once been oriented away from her. The idea of aligning with another man, another capital, required more than clever spreadsheets. It required trust and agency. Lucille did not need to say anything. Her hand, brief on Amara's shoulder, was counsel enough. Ask him how he measures control, she said softly. Ask him how he sees you when no one is looking. Leon smiled when Amara posed the question. The relief in his expression was small and human. Control is an ugly word, he admitted. We structure influence. I want your name on the door. I want your decisions to matter. I would never want to replace your voice with my echo. They spoke until the room changed its temperature. Agreements took the shape of questions answered and reservations aired. He detailed a structure, a boutique fund, nimble, focused on early-stage fintech and infrastructure in East and Central Africa, with local advisory boards and a governance charter that allocated meaningful decision rights to regionally based partners. He proposed equity participation for operators and advisors, vesting schedules that aligned long-term incentives, and a cap table designed to prevent top-down capture. When he finally reached into his briefcase and offered a draft term sheet, it was neither swagger nor seduction. It was work, pages of clauses and intentions laid out with the kind of clarity Amara respected. She read, line by line, parsing not only capital commitments, but cultural architecture. Who sat on advisory panels, how reporting would be handled, how exits would be considered. She found provisions that echoed her own values. Investments that prioritized durable institutions over quick flips, advisory shares tied to governance outcomes, explicit commitments to diversify leadership. At one point she paused and looked up. Why me? She asked, and the question was not vanity but calibration. You could pick half a dozen men with pedigrees who would take this offer. Leon did not dodge. He studied her as if reading the balance sheet of a life. Because you see things my models do not, he said simply. Because you were erased and still kept building. Because the market needs someone who has lived the problem and then solved it. And because I have done the due diligence on you in ways that respect the truth. I read your memos. I spoke to founders. I do not pity you. I value you. The clarity of his answer unfolded like a promise made in language she could evaluate. It did not erase her caution, but it displaced a corner of her fatigue with possibility. They agreed to a follow-up, a more formal negotiation in Belgravia, time to consult lawyers, to model returns, to sketch the first investment thesis. On the train back to her hotel, Amara felt the sudden, tentative buoyancy of someone given an opening that matched her work. She allowed herself a small, private optimism, not triumph, not denial, but the light steadiness of a plan beginning to hold weight. That evening, before sleep, she opened her notebook and wrote, in a hand that trembled only slightly, Hayes and Markov, test thesis, mobile payments plus embedded governance, pilot Nairobi Q2. The words felt true under her pen. The catalyst had arrived not as an epiphany, but as a careful mutual recognition of capacity, and the beginning of something that, if engineered well, could be both profitable and just. The morning Amara signed the partnership agreement, London was rinsed in a fragile kind of sunlight, the pale, uncertain kind that always made her think of beginnings. The document lay before her on the table at Leon's office in Belgravia, printed on paper heavy enough to remind one of consequence. The ink was black, clean, deliberate. Two signatures, two lives that had wandered through separate storms now converging in purpose. When she pressed the pen to paper, it was not triumph she felt, but equilibrium, the quiet satisfaction of something finally aligned. Leon poured coffee into porcelain cups and said, almost casually, "Welcome to the game where the rules can be rewritten." From that morning onward, her days began to run on different rhythms. She no longer lived by scarcity or by the anxious arithmetic of survival. Her mind, long trained to solve others' equations, was now free to construct her own. Hayes and Markov Capital was born small and sharp, like the first cut of an idea. Their offices occupied two minimalist rooms above a bookshop in Fitzrovia, bare wood floors, high windows, and a whiteboard crowded with names of regions, firms, and impossible dreams. Leon brought the capital and the network. Amara brought the framework, the data, the moral geometry. Together they built something that looked less like a fund and more like an experiment in redemption. Their first months were a blur of flights and phone calls. Nairobi, Lagos, Kigali, Accra. Each trip folded into the next until airports blurred into one long corridor. Yet in every meeting, every handshake, Amara's mind was alive with a pulse she hadn't felt since before Zurich. She spoke of markets, not as abstractions, but as living ecosystems. She talked of dignity as a metric, an unconventional term that startled investors, but lingered in their memory. Her presence altered rooms. In meetings, men who had once underestimated her now took notes. Women who had felt invisible began to lean forward. She didn't demand attention. It arrived, drawn by the clarity of her conviction. Leon often watched her in these moments with quiet admiration, as if witnessing an equation resolving itself. "You translate volatility into narrative," he said once, smiling. "You make risk sound like possibility." The firm's first major investment, a mobile credit infrastructure project in Nairobi, became their proving ground. Amara insisted on hiring local analysts, paying them fair wages, embedding training into every contract clause. "Sustainability isn't a slogan," she told Leon. "It's succession planning for justice." He laughed, but he agreed. When the project launched, adoption numbers doubled projections within the first quarter. The data was a revelation, but for Amara, the real victory was smaller, quieter. A woman in Kibera, standing in a sunlit kiosk, explaining that for the first time, she could secure a microloan without asking permission from her husband. That, Amara thought, was yield. From there, success became momentum. The fund grew through reputation rather than marketing. Venture journals began to whisper her name, the woman who understands markets without colonizing them. For every article that mentioned Leon's financial genius, another quoted Amara's precision and empathy. The symmetry of their partnership became mythic: capital and conscience, intellect and intuition. But even amid expansion, she remained disciplined in her solitude. She lived in a modest flat in South Kensington, walls lined with books and maps. Her days began before dawn and ended past midnight. She rose early to review reports, walked along the Thames to clear her thoughts, then returned to the endless negotiations that came with growth. The work filled the silence that heartbreak had once occupied. Leon sometimes joked that she was married to the fund. She smiled but never answered. In truth, her marriage was to the mission itself, to the idea that purpose could be architecture strong enough to live inside. Yet, in the privacy of evening, she sometimes caught herself wondering what remained of the woman who once believed in love as sanctuary. Was ambition a cure, or simply a different kind of hunger? Still, her heart softened in unexpected places. When she mentored young founders, women with trembling hands and perfect ideas, she felt something close to tenderness. She began hosting quiet dinners for them in her home, evenings without pretense or photographers, where they spoke of failures like shared scripture. Those nights reminded her that success, when held too tightly, can become its own exile. So she practiced generosity as resistance. By their second year, Hayes and Markov was managing 8 figures in assets and sitting on the board of 3 companies that were rewriting the economic playbook for East Africa. International banks sought collaboration. Government ministers requested her counsel. The woman who had once scrubbed other people's kitchen counters now sat at tables where policy was decided. Yet she carried no triumph in her tone. To those who met her, she remained grounded, deliberate, impossibly composed. The old world noticed. Zurich began to murmur her name again, this time with cautious admiration. Former colleagues reached out, emails full of pleasantries that thinly disguised curiosity. A magazine that once reported her downfall now requested an interview titled The Return of Amara Hayes. She declined. Her silence became her brand. Leon, half amused, half proud, would say, "You've become what they can't categorize, neither saint nor shark." She would smile. Perhaps that's what freedom sounds like. But even freedom, she learned, has echoes. There were nights when her reflection in the glass felt like a stranger's, someone too polished, too precise. She sometimes dreamed of her mother's voice on the phone, reminding her that rest was not failure. She missed laughter without agenda, mornings without meetings. Yet she knew the cost of stopping. The ledger of sacrifice was not yet balanced. In the winter of 2026, Hayes and Markov was invited to a summit in Geneva, a conference of global finance leaders. There, under the clean austerity of hotel chandeliers, Amara was approached by a journalist who, instead of questions, offered a simple observation. "You've become an institution, Ms. Hayes. Do you ever feel alone in it?" Amara paused, then smiled, an expression both tender and distant. "Institutions are built by people who know loneliness well," she said. Her words made it into print. They were quoted in think pieces, tweeted by entrepreneurs, analyzed by commentators who saw her as a symbol of resilience. But to her, they were simply true. In the quiet after the summit, Amara returned to London, stood by the window of her flat, and watched the city glow like circuitry. She thought of the girl who had once stood in the rain outside her own home, her life collapsing behind her. She thought of exile and ashes, of the blueprint drawn by candlelight, of the first client who believed in her again. The rise had not been loud. It had been precise, built on discipline, rebuilt from ruin, measured in dignity rather than applause. And as she closed her laptop that night, she realized that power, the kind she had fought to earn, no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like peace in motion. Amara had thought her work would teach her who she was. She had banked on action, on trajectory, on measurable return, to heal what the city and a marriage had taken. The spreadsheets had helped. The flights and contracts had steadied her. But there was an ache that data could not account for. A small and exact absence that returned each night when the screens dimmed and the whiteboards were wiped clean. It was one thing to reclaim markets. It was another to reclaim a self. Dr. Maya Okoro's office in Bloomsbury resembled a room written in soft affordances. A low armchair upholstered in warm fabric, books that smelled faintly of lemon, a window that let in March's pale honey. Maya, Nigerian-British, deliberate, and quick with a question, had a way of making silence feel like a question rather than a punishment. Amara found herself returning there not out of crisis anymore, but out of curiosity. "What happens," Maya would ask, "when the performance ends?" The first time Amara sat across from her, the city outside was soft with rain. She folded her hands and watched the way Maya cataloged the light. "How do you measure yourself now?" Maya asked without preamble, like a scalpel placed gently on a map. There followed an inventory that had nothing to do with balance sheets. Amara spoke of mornings she'd once used to rehearse meetings, of laughter carefully dosed for rooms, of evenings spent composing emails that disguised loneliness as strategy. She spoke of the fracture in Zurich as if it were both event and subject, an occurrence that had taught her how quickly the world could rewrite you. Maya listened, then asked a question that felt small and enormous. "Who is left when you are not producing?" It was a question that required excavation. Amara had always been fluent in the grammar of markets. She was less practiced in the language that described her own interior. Therapy became a practice of naming. She learned to tell stories about herself that were not designed for consumption or impression, but for understanding. She revisited the girl from Atlanta who loved numbers because they promised fairness. She sat with the woman who moved through Zurich ballrooms with a trained smile. She encountered the exhausted strategist who could not remember how to rest. Maya offered what Amara called a mirror, reflective, unadorned, and occasionally merciless. "You built a life to be seen," Maya said one session, "and then you learned that being seen is not the same as being known." The phrase lodged like a stone, and in its stillness, permitted Amara to breathe around it. Being known required risk. It demanded that she present herself without armor. That kind of exposure frightened her more than any boardroom. They worked with small tasks, practices that felt almost domestic in their intimacy. A week of writing 5 honest sentences each morning, not for publication or pitch decks, but for the page. A fortnight of doing one thing that was purely pleasurable. A pastry eaten without checking email, a walk without a phone. These were exercises that sounded trivial when spoken aloud, but enacted proved curative. The repetition of small truths became a new ledger, an account that credited Amara with moments rather than accomplishments. Maya also taught her to recognize the reflexes that had once protected her. In meetings, Amara had learned to soften language. At home, she had learned to swallow hurt. These reflexes had been functional when danger was imminent, but they calcified into patterns that prevented authentic connection. Naming them made them manageable. When Amara noticed the urge to apologize mid-sentence, she could pause and choose. Discipline, she discovered, was not only for work. It could be applied to the tender art of staying present. Outside of therapy, new habits surfaced like sap after thaw. Amara resumed kickboxing lessons in a studio on the fringes of Shoreditch, an old warehouse with mirrors and the smell of rubber mats. The work there was kinetic and honest. When she hit the bag, the motion translated rage into metronome. The trainer's count, 2, 3, rest, was oddly and gloriously ritualistic. It taught containment and release in a single breath. She took early morning runs through Hampstead Heath and watched the sky practice its own transitions, imperceptible at first and then total. The body, she learned, remembered what the mind sometimes forgot. There were episodes of tender disorientation. Once, at a dinner arranged by Leon for the fund's junior team, an analyst told a story about their childhood that made Amara laugh until she felt her eyes sting. She left the table that night with cheeks raw and warm, surprised by how much she had missed unguarded laughter. It was small, a flicker, but she cataloged it as progress. In the quiet rooms of her flat, Amara confronted a curious paradox. Competence had carried her to safety, but it had also been the scaffold of loneliness. There were advantages to being good at things that mattered, she thought. Yet the competence that once served as armor could keep warmth at bay. She began practicing being a beginner at things that had no ROI. Pottery classes in Notting Hill, reading novels without annotating, learning a handful of Polish phrases simply to enjoy the shape of them. The point was not mastery, but the permission to be imperfect. Therapy invited her to face a more intimate question. What exactly did she forgive herself for? There were the big transgressions, her silence when she had suspected the fracture, the ways she had accommodated a man who diminished her. And then there were the smaller omissions, moments when she had chosen career over rest, connections deferred for deliverables. Forgiveness, Maya suggested, was not a single act, but a curriculum. It required practice, repetition, and the willingness to be accountable without self-erasure. There were nights when the past still arrived like a brief storm. Amara would wake with an old ache and phone a friend. Lucille would tell a story that rectified memory. Margot would send a cutting, brilliant text that read like a corrective. Leon's presence at the fund was steadier than she had expected. Not a replacement for companionship, but a companion in work, who respected when she set boundaries. In those moments, Amara noticed she felt gratitude for alliances forged in the smoky aftermath of ruin. Slowly, a new vocabulary of selfhood developed. She learned to say, without flinching, "I am not available right now," and meant it. She learned how to speak of fear in the present tense rather than as past confession. She began to understand that identity is not a static ledger, but an ongoing practice of alignment. The mirror Maya held up showed someone who had been tempered by difficulty, not diminished by it. The most profound shift was subtle. Instead of asking herself, "Who can I be to others?" she began to ask, "Who can I be for myself?" The query reframed ambition from acquisitive motion into stewardship. She still wanted influence, still loved the rigor of structuring investments that altered lives. But influence now sat beside a new priority: sustaining the person who inhabited that influence. On an evening where the city was thin with light and the moon a careful coin, Amara walked to the window of her flat and watched the Thames move with the patient logic of a river. She thought of the woman who had arrived in Zurich with ambition like a bright suitcase, and of the one who now watched markets and memory with equal care. The mirror no longer reflected a single image. It showed a person in motion, a life composed of work and tenderness in equal measure. She closed her eyes, feeling the alignment like a steadying hand. The work would continue, the flights and contracts and meetings, but she carried now a small, private architecture, a practice of self that would hold when the applause ceased. In the quiet, she breathed into that knowledge and, for the first time in a long while, felt comfortable staying with herself. Becoming, Amara learned, was not a single ascent, but a sequence of small restorations. Habits rebuilt, relationships reconsidered, the slow accretion of choices that finally bore the weight of a life. The word carried with it the warmth of slow weather. Neither a revolution nor a rash triumph, but the patient reformation of character around values she could name and defend. Her mornings acquired a new liturgy. Before the city woke, she would stand by the kitchen window of her modest South Kensington flat, with a mug that still bore a faint ring of coffee from a friend's visit months ago, and read one chapter of something that bore no bearing on work: novels, essays, the occasional poem. She treated language not as weapon, but as nourishment. Later, she might walk to the fund, headphones tucked away, letting the street noise arrange her thoughts into the small coherences she favored. What to prioritize, who to meet, which young founder needed a longer conversation. The team at Hayes and Markoff grew slowly and deliberately. Amara hired for character as often as for skill. She wanted analysts who could parse numbers and human beings who could parse nuance. In the open plan office above the bookshop, she built rituals that mattered. A weekly failure share, where a junior partner described what had gone wrong and what they had learned. A monthly community dinner where local entrepreneurs and fund managers ate the same food and sat without hierarchy. A policy that ensured travel budgets included time for cultural immersion rather than mere logistics. These choices were not performative, they were infrastructural. They taught the organization to value curiosity over optics. Mentoring became one of her deepest pleasures. She invited young women, black, brown, from villages and high-rises alike, into her meetings with founders. She insisted they speak first, and then listened, deliberately and thoroughly. At one such dinner, a founder from Accra proposed a payment model that prioritized female agents in rural routes. The room met it with polite skepticism, until Amara asked two questions about cash flow and customer acquisition that reframed the proposal as a viable business case. The young woman's face, bright with shock and then steadied with pride, taught Amara that power could be most useful when it was given away. There were small rebellions in how she navigated offers. Boards came calling, prestigious seats with lovely plaques and safer influence. She declined more than she accepted, choosing instead to sit on advisory committees that prioritized impact metrics she believed in: educational access, sustainable employment, enterprise resilience. "It's not about prestige," she told Leon once over a late dinner of reheated takeout. "It's about what the seat enables. I want to be in rooms where the conversation is inconvenient and therefore, eventually, useful." Her private life folded into this becoming with the same peculiar patience. She dated sometimes in ways that felt exploratory rather than reparative. A man who loved pottery and asked about a chapter in a book she'd read aloud. A woman who had built a social enterprise and spoke of failure like scripture. None of these brief engagements asked to repair her past. They asked only to be known. and she practiced reciprocation without ceding herself. In one afternoon that she would remember, she sat knitting, awkwardly, with a friend who'd arrived raw from a failed launch, and found that the simple, shared silence of two hands in motion could be a kind of intimacy she liked better than grand declarations. Amara also began to name the contours of her generosity. She instituted a small fellowship through the fund. 3 young women a year would receive advisory hours, a seed stipend, and access to a network that typically required expensive introductions. Applications poured from places she had once only read about. She read each essay, late into nights, tracing the maps of courage that led others to risk. The fellowship became a tiny institution of its own, modest in budget, but immense in moral return. There were challenges, of course. Growth invited tension. Leon, who had grown comfortable with a certain understated swagger, sometimes worried aloud about scale and dilution. "We cannot be sentimental," he would warn gently. Amara would counter with calm arithmetic and an insistence that scale without governance becomes predatory. These sparring matches, legal versus ethical, speed versus durability, did not fracture them. They refined the fund's thesis, making their partnership less an arrangement of convenience and more a practice in mutual accountability. In quieter hours, she observed herself with less clinical detachment and more tenderness. She learned to forgive the woman who had stayed too long in a marriage, the woman who had once mistaken visibility for worth. She wrote letters to her younger self, short notes folded into a drawer, reminders like, "You are not a landmark. You are a territory. Stay curious. Keep company with truth." Sometimes she read them aloud, not for anyone else, but to hear the voice steady in a room where it mattered least to be heard. Her mother's voice returned as balm. They spoke more often, and when Amara visited Atlanta, she allowed herself to be ordinary, to eat biscuits in a kitchen wallpapered with years, to inhale the low, unflinching kindness of home. Those visits were not regressions. They were recharges, small landscapes of belonging that reminded her of the person who had loved numbers because they promised fairness, who believed that work could be a means to a wider justice. As the fund matured, Amara discovered that becoming was less about becoming someone else than ceasing to be small. She allowed ambition to be a vehicle for other people's roots, rather than a solitary ladder. She found that tenderness could sit alongside rigor, that discipline could be an act of care rather than punishment. And in the mirror, she recognized a woman who had learned to hold her own laughter, to accept failings as tutor rather than judge. One evening, after a long day of term sheets and mentorship interviews, she walked alone to the little bookshop below their office and bought a volume of poems. On the tram home, she opened a random page and read, aloud in her head, a stanza that folded perfectly into the arc of her years. "To become is to arrive at the self slowly, like tide finding its shore." She smiled then, small, private, and felt, for the first time in a long while, that arrival and motion could coexist. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, the sort of day that dissolved quietly into work, meetings, and the low, constant hum of accomplishment. Amara was at her desk in the Fitzrovia office, half listening to a junior analyst present projections for a new investment in Ghana, when her assistant placed a pale envelope in front of her. It was thick, its edges gilded faintly with gold leaf, the kind of envelope meant not to be opened, but to be anticipated. Her name, Miss Amara Hayes, was handwritten in black ink so deliberate it almost looked engraved. She recognized the handwriting instantly, though she had not seen it in years. Ethan Coles. For a long moment she said nothing. The room continued its rhythm, voices, numbers, the rustle of papers, but all of it receded into a thin, distant noise. She felt the weight of the envelope, absurdly heavy for something so elegant. "Should I?" her assistant began. "I'll handle it," Amara said softly. When the door closed behind the team, she turned the envelope over, tracing her thumb along the wax seal, dark burgundy, stamped with an emblem she knew too well. A lion entwined with laurels, Ethan's firm. She broke the seal carefully, as though undoing it too quickly might release ghosts she wasn't yet prepared to see. The invitation was simple and cruel in its beauty. The Global Impact Gala, Zurich Grand Palais, January 15th, 2027. An event hosted by Cole & Vale Foundation to celebrate a decade of transformative partnerships. At the bottom, in graceful script, Ethan and Harper Cole cordially invite Miss Amara Hayes to attend as a guest of honor. Guest of honor. Amara let out a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. The irony was exquisite. Once, she had stood in those rooms as an ornament to his success. Now, they invited her as a symbol of it. For a long while, she sat very still, letting memory unspool in silence. She remembered the Zurich winter of her exile, the rain, the betrayal, the sound of her suitcase wheels on cobblestone as she left the apartment that had once felt like promise. She remembered the sharp smell of candle wax and wine in that room, Harper's laughter still echoing behind her. And she remembered how, that night, she had promised herself she would not look back. Yet here it was, the past, embossed in gold. She set the invitation aside and stared out the window. London's sky was a gray so fine it looked almost translucent. Across the street, the shopkeeper in the bookstore below was placing new titles in the window. Biographies, treatises, a slim novel about second chances. Second chances. For a moment, Amara felt the familiar stirring of anger, the reflexive defense against intrusion. But beneath it, something else flickered. Curiosity. What did Ethan expect to prove by inviting her? Redemption? Magnanimity? Or had the gesture been Harper's, calculated and polite, a final demonstration that they had nothing to fear from the woman they had wronged? Leon found her still staring at the letter an hour later. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, setting his briefcase down. "Perhaps I have." She passed the invitation across the table. He read it quickly, then looked up, eyebrows raised. "You're not seriously considering going?" "I haven't decided, Amara." His voice softened. "You don't owe them your presence." "I know." She folded her hands, her nails tracing the edge of the paper. "But maybe I owe it to myself." That night, long after the office emptied, she lingered. The city outside glittered faintly under drizzle, the streets alive with the anonymity she'd come to love. She thought about what Maya had said months earlier during one of their sessions. Closure is not a door slamming shut. It's a window opening quietly when you stopped expecting the view to change. Perhaps this invitation was that window. Not an olive branch, not an apology, but an opportunity to stand once more in the place where her life had broken and discover that it no longer had power over her. Still, the thought of returning to Zurich tightened something in her chest. She could already imagine the scent of those polished marble halls, the sound of champagne glasses chiming, the laughter threaded with pretense. She could imagine seeing Ethan's face across a room and feeling nothing, or perhaps too much. A week later, she brought it up to Maya, whose calm was as measured as ever. "What do you hope to find there?" Maya asked. "Nothing," Amara said after a pause. "That's the point. I want to find nothing. I want to stand there and feel the absence of pain." Maya smiled gently. "Then go, if you can do it for yourself, not for the story others will tell." Amara nodded. "I don't need to prove that I've survived. I just need to see that I have." The days leading up to the gala unfolded with the precision of an old clock winding itself forward. The fund continued its work. The world went on. Yet beneath the order of her life, a quiet current hummed. She found herself reviewing the past not with bitterness, but with a scholar's detachment, as though cataloging artifacts of a civilization that had once existed and now belonged to history. When she finally decided to attend, she made no announcement. She informed no one except Leon and her assistant, who booked the ticket under a discreet pseudonym. The decision brought no thrill, only stillness, a certainty as clean as cold water. The morning of her departure, she packed light. A single dress folded carefully into a garment bag, black silk, minimal, sculptural, something that would not compete with the noise of luxury, but would silence it. Her passport, her speech notes for a summit she planned to attend afterward in Geneva, a small notebook for reflections. At Heathrow, waiting by the gate, she caught her reflection in the glass, a composed woman in her early 40s, elegance tempered by gravity. The world that had once discarded her now quoted her, sought her counsel, built panels around her ideas. Yet the woman in the reflection did not seem proud or triumphant. She looked simply whole. On the flight, Clouds gathered like sheets of silver. Zurich lay somewhere beyond them, unchanged and yet entirely different, because she was. She closed her eyes and thought of the girl who had first arrived in that city more than a decade ago. Hopeful, open, unguarded. That version of herself had died there once. But this woman was returning, not as ghost nor guest. She was coming home to the truth that no one, not even Ethan Cole, had ever truly taken anything from her. The invitation, she realized, had not been for her to attend their celebration. It was for her to witness her own completion. The Zurich Grand Palais wore its history like a velvet cloak. High arches, marble staircases, chandeliers that spilled a patient, old light across the room. Guests moved as if on fixed tracks, conversations feathered around the served plates, the small courtesies of a society that rehearsed politeness until it became habit. Amara's entry did not come with fanfare. She walked in alone, an unembellished silhouette against the golden hush, and the room adjusted its breath to match hers. She had chosen deliberately, a midnight gown cut cleanly at the throat, sleeves that suggested modesty rather than denial, hair pulled back to allow the line of her face to speak. There were no dramatics, no jewelry meant to blind, only an economy of presence that made the chandeliers seem ornamental. People noticed, as they always did notice a woman who had once been written out of a story and then returned to author her own paragraphs. Ethan's table was where society's gaze pooled. Partners, patrons, ambassadors, faces that had once smiled at them both with the easy courtesy of shared capital. Harper sat close to him, radiant in a gown of pale silk that caught the light like a promise. For a moment, their tableau looked complete. Then the room pivoted. A chair in a distant corner went empty. A whisper slid across a balcony. A photographer found new focus. She moved through the space with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed not lines, but steadiness. Margot found her first, a quick embrace at the side of the room, fingers warm and genuine. Then Lucille, whose steady, unperformed pride seemed to anchor Amara's shoulders with a small nod. People approached to offer condolences and congratulations both, curious gestures from a social world that liked to see arcs resolved neatly. She permitted them their courtesies, then allowed herself to drift toward the stage where a moderator waited with the charity's agenda. When her name was announced, the room folded inward. She stepped to the microphone without notes, not because she disliked preparation, she had prepared, but because this was one speech that needed to be spoken cleanly, without the filter of paper. The light over the lectern softened, and her shadow fell long on the polished floor. She began not with accusation, but with fact. The foundation's work, the communities benefited, the numbers that mattered. Her voice was steady, warm, deliberate. "Good evening," she said. "We gather in rooms like these because we believe capital can be animated toward consequence. Tonight we celebrate partnerships that do not extract, but that create conditions for dignity, education, access, infrastructure." She spoke of projects in Accra, of mobile networks in Nairobi, of seed funds that had been matched and multiplied. The crowd listened as if the words were a ledger being read aloud. Then she shifted, not with spectacle, but with the subtle authority of someone reclaiming the narrative. "Rebuilding," she said, "is not a metaphor. It is a skill." Her cadence softened. When a town rebuilds after flood or conflict, the work is messy and slow. It requires humility, patience, and the kind of long-term thinking that is rarely glamorous. A murmur went through the room, the kind that signals recognition not only of competence, but of moral clarity. She spoke of dignity as a metric. She named how development projects succeed when local expertise is centered, when advisory seats are filled by those who live the challenges they solve. She told a quietly precise story, a microloan in a Nairobi kiosk that had let a woman buy inventory and, months later, pay school fees for her daughter. The woman's gratitude was small and exact. She had not been given charity, she had been given capacity. The room listened differently then. The applause that followed was not the perfunctory clap of gala manners, but something genuine, the sort that arrives when language meets lived consequence. Ethan stood in the crowd like someone watching a film of his life, in which he had missed a scene. He had expected complaints, perhaps, or an angry denunciation to satisfy a thirst for spectacle. He found instead a speech that was both intelligent and tender, a rendering of impact into the human scale. Harper's face, which had glowed with the triumph of public approval all evening, shifted in subtle degrees. Surprise, then discomfort, then that particular recognition of not being the center of a conversation she had assumed would orbit her. As Amara spoke on about governance clauses and local advisory boards, about markets that rewarded patience rather than spectacle, people began to gather around her after she stepped down. Diplomats wanted to ask questions about policy. Fund managers wanted to know how to structure advisory equity. Founders wanted to speak of scaling without selling their mission. She met each request with ease, translating technical details into ethical architecture. It was not grandstanding. It was the competent, quiet exertion of influence. At a table not far from the stage, a photographer enclosed in the professional trance clicked away, and a headline that had once foretold her ruin now felt clumsy and irrelevant. The night had a new center of gravity. Harper retreated into the safe orbit of friends and small talk. The conversation around her thinned. Ethan watched. The realization that he might have miscalculated the moral economy of power unspooled across his features like a slow tide. He had chosen a life that required less confronting of consequence, preferring instead the polish of appearances. Seeing Amara now, revered, not for a curated story but for actual consequence, forced an audit he had not scheduled. At one point, as Amara accepted a question from a young minister, the photographer moved closer to capture a frame. Amara in the foreground, animated and precise. Ethan in the background, eyebrows knitted, a man suddenly measuring loss in the small language of expression. The photograph did not lie. It simply held what the room had been unwilling to see. When the gala wound toward its end, the energy had shifted palpably. The engagement announcement that had been intended as the night's crest, photos, congratulations, a toast, felt oddly prosaic now, as if someone had dimmed the set. Guests lingered in groups, talking policy and partnerships rather than tablature of taste. A few attendees sought out Amara to speak of joint projects. Some sought her card and left with the quick, almost astonished air of those who had discovered an answer. She left the stage not triumphant in the theatrical sense, but calm in the sovereign way of someone whose axis had returned to true north. The thing she had gone to Zurich to do was not to humiliate, nor to heal by spectacle. It was to stand within the field of her expertise and let truth do its work. The room finally recognized that she belonged not by marriage or appearance, but by the measure of what she built. Outside, against the cold of Zurich air, she paused on the Grand Palais steps. Snow dusted the marble like ash and light. She looked back once, across the glass, into a room that had once contained her ruin, and now reflected, with crisp inevitability, the woman she had become. There was no triumph in her chest, only an altar of quiet knowledge. That rebuilding was a practice, not an event, and that the reckoning she had sought all these years had been granted, not by revenge, but by competence made visible. She descended into the night with the steadiness of someone who had completed a necessary measurement. The ledger of her life had been balanced that evening, not by the collapse of others, but by the solidity of her own work. The gala had thinned into its quiet hours. Champagne emptied into the last coupe, orchestral strings folded into a hush, and the crowd began to unspool into coats and goodbyes. Outside, Zurich's cold pressed the night into glass. Amara gathered her shawl with deliberate fingers, the silk a small protest against the weather and, perhaps, against memory. She had intended to leave without fanfare. She preferred departures that felt like punctuation rather than exclamation. He found her on the landing of the Grand Palais stair, the marble beneath their shoes cool and patient. Ethan came up the steps as if climbing an equation he had not solved. Hesitant, then urgent. The evening's laurels had drifted away, leaving him diminished in a way the harsh light of consequence sometimes makes necessary. He was not yet drunk, but there was a tremor at the edges of him, the sort that comes when a man recognizes a horizon he cannot command. Amara, he said, the name both an address and a summoning. There was a tenderness threaded through his voice that might once have been comfort. Now it sounded like plea. She turned. The motion was simple. She let the moonlight touch the plane of her cheek as if to test whether the world would still behave the same. His face, under the cold lamp, looked smaller than the one she had married. Lines at the temples, a softness in his jaw that success alone could not harden back into certainty. For a moment he simply looked at her, as though cataloging a specimen he had once possessed. "Ethan," she returned, neutral. Her breath made small clouds that vanished. "You made it." "I had to speak with you," he said, stepping closer in a way that tried to reclaim intimacy and found only distance. "Please, can we just talk out here? I need you to hear me." She studied him as she might examine a contract, seeking clarity in clauses and motive. "Then speak," she said. He swallowed, searching for sentences that would undam the hurt. "I've been an idiot," he began, the confession raw and imperfect. "I thought I knew what I wanted. I was wrong. Watching you tonight, seeing what you've done, I see it now. I see what I lost. I thought success would feel complete, but without you, it's hollow. I was afraid, Amara. I ran toward ease, and in doing so, I traded the only person who ever made me better." The words tumbled, earnest and late. There was a shiver of sincerity that made the edges of his admission almost beautiful. It would be easy for any listener to mistake that beauty for catharsis. Amara felt it, the small human ache at the heart of a man who had belatedly recognized error. But recognition, she knew, only mattered insofar as it altered behavior. Confession without conversion is a ledger entry, not restitution. "You made a choice," she said quietly. "You didn't lose me, Ethan. You chose someone else. You confused convenience for courage." Her voice was not harsh. It held the same cool, deliberate authority she brought to negotiations and boardrooms. In it was the unadorned truth of someone who had learned to separate performance from personhood. He flinched as if struck. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said. "I thought, maybe if I waited, you would understand. I thought the anniversary, the timing." He faltered, the rehearsed rationales collapsing into something thin and febrile. "I see now how small that was. You hit it," Amara interrupted, not to be cruel, but because the fact required naming. "You arranged your life so pain would arrive on your terms. That is not courage, that is calculation." Her eyes were steady. There was no triumph there, only the measured grief of an economist cataloging loss. Ethan's hands, which had once been so deft in the mechanics of comfort, found nothing to do with themselves. He stepped closer, an old instinct to bridge distance. "I love you," he said desperately. The phrase arrived raw and without strategy, and for a sliver of a moment Amara imagined the life they had once sketched. Small apartments, passionate nights, shared spreadsheets and silly private jokes. She felt the pull of memory the way a tide pulls at pebbles, irresistible but not commanding. She regarded him for a long beat, not to punish but to honor the gravity of his admission and the reality of her own response. "Love is not a reclamation project," she finally said. "Love is not a thing you decide on a Friday and take back on Monday. When you say you love me now, it sounds like you are mourning what was convenient to keep." The words landed not as accusation, but as clarity. Harper, downstairs and still wrapped in a cloak of glitter, watched from a distance, her face a mirror of confusion and the dawning knowledge that the narrative she had expected to author had become provisional. There was a small, cold dignity to the scene, a man exposed in a way he had not practiced for, and a woman who had learned how to hold a whole life without contingent applause. "You ask for forgiveness," Amara said, softening. "That is not yours to demand." She folded her hands, feeling the scarf's silk between her fingers. The night smelled of citrus and old varnish. "I do not want to be the measure you use to calibrate regret. I want to be someone whose presence is not contingent on your convenience." Ethan's voice cracked. "Please, tell me what to do." She looked at him then, with the compassion she had learned to cultivate for difficult truths. "Do the work you should have done a long time ago," she said. "Don't ask me to be your lesson. Learn it without me. Live with the consequence of your choice honestly. I have my own life to steward." It was a permission and a refusal wrapped in the same breath, an injunction for him to act, and for herself to be freed from the burden of that action. He nodded as if receiving a verdict and a way forward in equal measure. There was humility in that acquiescence, but also the realization that not all confessions change the past. For a moment, the two of them stood on the marble steps like figures in a study. No fanfare, no dramatics, only the quiet closing of a chapter that needed no theater to be true. Ethan opened his mouth once more, then closed it. There was nothing left that either could give the other that would reroute the ledger of years. "I wish you peace," he said, the sentence a benediction and a goodbye. "And I wish you truth," Amara replied. He lingered, then descended the stairs into the gathered guests, into the life he had shaped and would now have to inhabit in full view. She watched him go with the same calm reserve she brought to difficult meetings. Steady, composed, finally immune to theatrics. She lingered a heartbeat longer, feeling the night as if it were a thing she could hold in both hands. Then she turned, the movement simple and unceremonious, and walked away from the marble into the winter air, away from the man she had loved, toward the life she had deliberately rebuilt. Her steps were steady. The past was behind her not as an enemy, but as a tutor whose lessons she had finally learned. Spring came to London in a way that felt almost reverential. Green unfurling at the edges of parks, the afternoons lengthening as if to give everyone a second chance at brightness. Amara woke one morning to a sky the color of unclaimed possibility and, without theatricality, decided to run. The ritual had become part of her reclamation, a steady rhythm that grounded thought into motion, and today the pavement felt like a metronome, keeping time with a heartbeat finally at ease. She ran through the quiet lanes of Hampstead, past dog walkers and early coffee sippers, the city giving up its small kindnesses. Her breath matched the cadence of her feet. She thought of balance sheets and microloans and the countless tiny conversations that had added up into the shape of Hayes and Markov. She thought of the many hands, Lucille's blunt insistence, Margot's stubborn loyalty, Leon's steady capital, that had braided into a structure strong enough to hold other people's futures. For a moment she let gratitude be simple and unadorned. The thought did not dilute her solitude, it crowned it. When she returned home, the flat smelled faintly of bergamot and old books. She drank tea with the slow attention of someone who had once measured worth by productivity and had since learned richness in pause. There were letters on her desk, requests, proposals, invitations, each a small spade into the next field of work. There were also postcards from fellows the fund had supported, handwritten notes that read like maps back to purpose. "Because of your advisory hours, we hired our first woman technician. Our village bank opened last month." These were the returns that landed softer than profit margins and mattered in ways numbers alone could not measure. The fund had grown, yes, into more than a phrase on a balance sheet, but what buoyed her was not the capital under management. It was the architecture she had built. Local advisory boards had become standard practice across their investments. Equity for advisors ensured that those who shaped strategy also shared in outcomes. An internal fellowship provided mentorship and a modest stipend to young women founders. And watching those women speak with confidence at regional summits became a kind of daily sacrament. Amara met with mentees in a narrow dining room she kept for such gatherings. No photographers, no glossy press, only food passed around like ordinary abundance. She loved to listen. She loved the small gravity of attention, how a question could tilt a plan into clarity. One evening, a young founder from Accra arrived with a nervous bundle of notes. 2 hours later, she left with a pilot agreement and a steadier gait. Amara watched her step into the street and felt something like joy, clean and immediate. Personal life, too, had settled into a generous pattern. She dated, yes, and sometimes the meetings were sweetly ordinary. Tea at an out-of-the-way cafe, conversation that did not perform. She learned the grace of being known without needing to be restored. When she returned home from late flights, there were calls from her mother that were longer than business updates, full of recipes, neighborhood gossip, the small, unglamorous threads of life that tethered her to a past kind enough to remind her where she'd come from. There were still echoes of the past that surfaced in private, an article that briefly rehashed the ruin that once defined her. a message from a former colleague, now awkward with envy. But the echoes came and passed like weather. They no longer rearranged the furniture of her interior. Ethan's name appeared occasionally in think pieces that discussed the cost of ambition in marriage. And once, in a conference hall in Geneva, she saw him in the audience, a face in the crowd rather than a presence at her elbow. For the first time, his silhouette registered as anecdote rather than axis. She offered no glance of triumph. She had learned that liberation is the absence of spectacle. She kept a small ritual. Once a month, she walked to a riverside bench with a notebook and wrote 3 things she was willing to abandon and 3 things she intended to hold. The practice functioned like a compass. Sometimes the abandonments were the expected, grudges that had calcified, the urge to be perfectly understood. Sometimes small, like a tendency to equate success with ceaseless motion. The things she held were steadier: curiosity, moral exactitude, tenderness. One autumn evening, after a summit where she had moderated a panel on inclusive capital design, a woman approached her backstage, an entrepreneur from Nairobi whose pilot had just graduated into a sustainable enterprise. The woman's voice trembled with the combination of exhaustion and triumph. "I used to think I had to leave to be taken seriously," she said. "You gave us permission to build here." Amara felt the words land like an offering. She replied with the modesty she carried like a practiced kindness. "You always had permission. The work is simply to see it." The fund continued to grow, not for growth's sake, but because systems that favor equity create their own momentum. Governments called for consultations. Panels invited her voice. Students wrote theses citing the advisory model she had helped design. Her name, once a headline of ruin, became a footnote in case studies, and then a chapter in curricula that taught not only how to invest, but how to do so with care. And private tenderness prospered in small things. Lucille came to stay one winter, and they cooked meals from the old country, speaking of memory and strategy and the way both require patience. Margot and Amara lunched in a sunlit cafe and laughed about the absurdities of social calendars. Leon sent occasional notes, less about ledgers, more about the poetry of a well-run governance charter. The constellation of her life had shifted from solitary orbit to something that felt like constellation, interdependent and luminous. On a quiet morning, Amara found a letter in her mailbox written in a hand she recognized. Harper's. The note was brief, careful, an admission that the young woman had learned the cost of a life built on image rather than substance. There was no plea, no expectation, only a recognition and a wish for honesty. Amara read it twice, then folded it and placed it beneath a stack of papers. There was no triumph in the act, only a human compassion that had room for regret without being changed by it. Liberation, Amara discovered, was not the dramatic unmaking of enemies, nor the final silencing of memory. It was quieter, a life rearranged so that she could rest without guilt, a mind that could read markets and harbor tenderness without contradiction, a calendar that had time for both meetings and unremarkable small joys. It was the permission to choose continuity over spectacle, steady work over performative victory. That day, standing at her office window, she watched the city settle into evening. Lights blinked on like small promises. The river moved in patient certainty. She thought of the girl from Atlanta who had once believed success was a destination, and of the woman she had become. A steward of capital, a builder of institutions, a friend who could love without losing herself. She smiled, not the sharp smile of someone proving a point, but the soft, plain smile of someone who has learned the value of staying. The liberation she lived was not an end, but the most generous beginning. A life of work, tenderness, and quiet authority. If Amara's journey moved you, share how it resonated. Comment with the moment that stayed with you. And follow for more chapters of stories about reinvention and quiet strength.